Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Dr. Francisco Pallares has been selected as the new Director of Business Development at Spaceport America. Dr. Pallares joins the New Mexico Spaceport Authority from Sul Ross State University and was the former Deputy Director for Economic Development at the City of Las Cruces. And he joins me now on the Terra podcast. Francisco, welcome.
Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you for the invitation.
My pleasure. Glad to have you with us today. Now, Spaceport America has established itself as kind of the premier spaceport, private spaceport for commercial spaceflight. So what can we expect from Spaceport America in the next couple of years?
Well, what you can expect, Tom, is that we ramp up the activity of all the different things that we have going on at the spaceport. We have multiple tenants, we have multiple customers that are launching out of spaceport, plus probably the anchor tenant and the most famous customer that we have is also expecting to ramp up the activity that they have going on at the spaceport. This is being Virgin Galactic. And we are excited. We're excited. We're open for business, and we're trying to get as much momentum as possible in order to have that spaceport be working and up and having a lot of activity going in there.
In fact, Virgin Galactic, I think, is planning, as we record this on Wednesday, they have a launch planned for tomorrow, for Thursday. Is the weather still looking good for that launch tomorrow?
So far, so good. Yes, and we'll be there to support them, and we'll be there to have the agency be as part of the protocols and the process that we have going on. Make sure that everything is good. Maybe making sure that everything is good to go. For the safety aspects as well. So we'll be there to support them, and we'll be there to be part of their activity as well.
But they don't have the kind of instantaneous launch window that SpaceX, for instance, has to get to the International Space Station. It's just they open a launch window and says, we'll go when everything's ready to go. Correct.
And multiple things. On the little time that I've been in the aerospace industry, one of the main aspects that I've learned is that the only thing that is certain is that there's a lot of uncertainties, right? So that's probably the only thing that I know for sure is that there's a lot of things that can happen and could potentially derail things and take it in a different direction. But yes, I mean, one of the key aspects of the aerospace industry, which is actually a very different industry in itself, is that there are multiple things that have to take place, and there are multiple things that can happen, including weather, right? That might not necessarily take you to the place in which you want to take it. But for everything so far looks good, and we're knocking on wood so that everything goes smoothly tomorrow.
Well, I just have to tell you that I was at Cape Canaveral for the Crew 6 launch, for the first Crew 6 launch attempt, and I was out, and that launch, of course, was scheduled at about 1:50 in the morning, and when they scrubbed the launch at 2 minutes and 18 seconds to launch, and we're all standing out there on the Cape at 1:45 in the morning saying, what? So you just never know.
You never know. Exactly. You never know.
Francisco, tell us about your role there at Spaceport America.
My role currently is the Director of Business Development. So the primary role, kind of like in the general aspect, it has to do with 3 primary actions. I will actually put it like more 4 primary actions. The first one is, of course, bringing industry to the spaceport, bringing industry to the state of New Mexico, bringing industry to Sierra County and Doña Ana County, which are some of the main providers that have made the spaceport possible even in the first place, right? The aerospace related type of businesses, right? We're focusing mostly on the suborbital currently, right? The Spaceport America has 2 licenses, one for horizontal launch and one for the vertical launch. We have a 12,000-foot runway by 200 feet, right? So it's an amazing runway in which a lot of different aircraft can land in there. We also have a vertical launch area, right? And the vertical launch area is where we can launch some of the rockets, and we have several pads, concrete pads that can help us for that. But one of the main ones that we have is the 200 by 200 foot pad, and in which there's one of our tenants actually currently launches out of there, which is Up Aerospace. And there are other tenants that have used it for multiple other aspects, right? So that we have a lot of that activity that is, we're mostly focused on the suborbital. We're currently working actually to bring in the reentry license from the FAA.
Mm.
And this would allow us to bring other types of vehicles and actually start thinking about other potential customers that we can be thinking about in order to bring him to Spaceport America. If that happens, Tom, Spaceport America is going to be the first one that has the 3 licenses in place, right? It's going to be the first one that has the vertical license from the FAA, the horizontal license from the FAA, and the reentry license from the FAA. So from the inland ports, right? I should probably say that from the inland ports, because, you know, the big ones and the ones that are on the coasts, they have some advantages over us, but I think that probably the biggest advantage that we have is that we're the only spaceport that shares that restricted airspace. So the restricted airspace portion that allows us to be very competitive, it comes because of White Sands Missile Range, right? We're completely adjacent to White Sands Missile Range, and that allows us to coordinate with White Sands. We actually have an agreement with White Sands, a memorandum of agreement. And from there, we can use their restricted airspace so long as we coordinate with them in order to make launches. And the only other place in the nation that has that capacity, Tom, is actually at the White House. So we have only those 2 areas have restricted airspace. You're not going to see a flight. If you see that in the flight patterns, you just see a black spot right there that there's absolutely no flight that goes through there. And we share that, of course, because of White Sands. We're, again, immediately adjacent to White Sands. Now, one of the key factors as well is that we're in such a remote area that a lot of things, if something goes wrong, nothing goes wrong, right? Because it's completely remote. I mean, we have that ability of operating in an area that there's not a lot of people in there. And at the same time, it gives us the ability, because we're 1 hour away from Las Cruces, right, which is the second largest city in the state of New Mexico, and we're 30 minutes away from Truth or Consequences, right, which is a very nice town in New Mexico that has the hot springs, and they have a lot of things that they have going on. So we have that ability of bringing workers, we have that ability of bringing businesses, we have that ability of commuting, right? You can come to the spaceport, just drive 1 hour if you're coming from Cruces. And you can be there, right? It's 2.5 hours away from Albuquerque. So it's centrally located in the state, that it makes it very appealing. But at the same time, we get to enjoy some of the benefits of being remote and in a restricted airspace that allows us to keep it with that. So that's one of the aspects that we have from the aerospace businesses, right? So trying to aim for the suborbitals, trying to aim at how can we build or create some of the hypersonic corridors that we want to see as well. So we have those things going on, and working with the FAA license for the reentry license. So we have that aspect going on the aerospace side. From the non-aerospace side, we are also a very nice place for conducting a lot of different things, a lot of different experiments that do not necessarily that would need a remote place to do these types of experiments, right? So we have different customers that have used the different pads. We have certain things that need to explode and things like that. I mean, that you need to control them, right?
Sure.
And we also conduct businesses with some of the companies that need to test their things and to see how they interact and gather the data and also be able to do some of those additional things. We also have, so we have the aerospace, the non-aerospace. We also, from the non-aerospace related business, besides exploding certain things, right? They probably cannot say much more than that. But we also have a lot of television, right? The gateway to space. You have seen the imagery right there, which is the hangar that the Virgin Galactic uses. It's beautiful. You can shoot commercials, you can shoot movies. So there's plenty of advantages that we have also from that side. So we have the aerospace, the non-aerospace as part of the business development section, but as well as part of the business development section, we are in charge of organizing, along with our partners with the ESRA, right, which is the Experimental Science Rocket Association. ESRA, one of our main partners, is conducting the Spaceport America Cup. And the Spaceport America Cup, Tom, is coming up on the 19th, the week of the 19th to the 24th of June. And we are basically an area that just 150 teams all across the world come here to Spaceport, come here to City of Las Cruces in New Mexico, and they launch their rockets out of Spaceport America. It has turned into such a big event, Tom, that some countries have tried to replicate it in Portugal, in Mexico, in Turkey, but it's not even close to the number of rocketeers that we have in our competition. So we have one of our team members, Felicity Nevares. She is the person that handles that from Spaceport America. She handles the cup. And we're excited about the cup that we have coming up on the 19th, and then on the 24th, which probably you should actually show up and come over here and see what the excitement is about, and see all the things that keep happening. And then besides that, on the aerospace, non-aerospace business, the cup, we also handle a lot of the relationship building, a lot of the public outreach, a lot of STEM tours and doing tours to the spaceport, and the educational aspect, and kind of like that outer face of the spaceport itself. So we do a lot of outreach, we do a lot of communications, we participate in a lot of committees, and all of that is basically under the business development section. So it's a big section with only like 4 people on it. So we all wear different hats, and we try to keep as much as possible. And so we're high-paced, but we're very, very happy to be here.
Well, maybe in a couple of years, we'll have enough budget that budgets can stuff off for the Spaceport America's Cup. Tell me a little bit about your background and how you got into the world of space.
That's a very interesting perspective. My background is I have a deformation as an economist, Tom. I have a deformation as an economist. It's not a formation because it's actually a deformation. You stop thinking normally, right? After you study economics. So my bachelor's was in philosophy and economics from the University of Texas at El Paso. I finished my master's in science and economics from the University of Texas at El Paso. And then I finished my doctorate in economic development at New Mexico State University. For a long time, my focus was in doing research, right? I was a research assistant. Then I was doing research in multiple different topics, from border economics to regional economic development, to international economics, to some topics even on health economics and stuff like that. So I did a lot of research, and I was mostly in the world of doing research and analysis. I also used to be a professor. Well, I still teach a few classes every now and then, but I moved more towards the academia side, right? But then after a while, I started looking at it. I was like, well, I think that I could be having a greater impact. So I started moving more towards the practical side of economic development. And I was hired at the City of Las Cruces, first as an economist, right, doing the analysis on economic impacts, fiscal impact analysis, cost-benefit analysis, as well as forecasting, things of that nature. But then I started moving more towards economic development itself. And at that point, it was an amazing period of time for me, right? It was, let's move away from the desk and let's start getting into the streets, right? Let's start having face-to-face time with the businesses, talking to them, conducting with them, seeing what their worries are about, seeing how you can be of their assistance. And that's when I started integrating myself into the world of economic development, right? Plus the education and all of those aspects. It was actually a very smooth transition. I really, really enjoyed my time at the City of Las Cruces in terms of economic development. We were working in workforce development issues. We were working in business retention and expansion strategies. We were working in how to attract businesses to the region. So that world is an amazing world in which I think I evolved very, very nicely from it, right? So I really like talking to businesses, really like talking to agencies, really like talking about sites and connections to utilities and what is it that you need and how many people are you looking for, and making calls and making connections. So that was my main aspect of this time. So when that happened, that's probably one of the reasons of why I started integrating myself more into the space-related type of businesses. It was actually because of economic development, right? I had made some connections with some agencies. So there's an aerospace cluster manufacturing in Chihuahua City, right? And I knew the folks in Chihuahua City from the economic development side. So when I talked to them, I was like, oh, by the way, there's a spaceport here in New Mexico. So how can we make some connections happen? And back then I didn't have any knowledge, right, of the space industry. So I went over there to Chihuahua City, see exactly what they were manufacturing, they took me to some of the maquiladoras over there and see what were some of the activity that was going on. And my thought process was, why not integrating? Mexico currently doesn't have a spaceport, right? So they have all of the manufacturing, they have a lot of the design, they have a lot of different things, but they have nowhere to test it. So to me, that's immediately a business idea. Okay, why not doing some of the testing over here, right? In this commercially built spaceport that can happen here in New Mexico, right? And then connecting with the industry in Mexico. So back then I was still in economic development with the City of Las Cruces. So I contacted the people in Spaceport America and I started making the connections. So we ultimately, long story short, we ended up inviting some of the dignitaries from the state of Chihuahua, the Secretary of Economic Development, to come here to Spaceport America and look at some of the facilities and look at some of the things in which we could collaborate. So from there, that's when I started moving more towards academia again. I got a very nice offer with Sul Ross State University. And that's when I moved back to academia for a little bit. But then once Spaceport America actually announced this position and based on all of the previous work we had worked together in the past, I think that it was a great fit for me. And it's been an amazing 9 weeks that I've been working since we started here.
Well, I'm glad to have you on so early on in your career, and I hope we'll be able to talk again. I'm talking with Dr. Francisco Pallares, Director of Business Development on the Terra podcast. Take a moment right now to click subscribe to be sure you don't miss any of the podcasts, or if you're watching on YouTube, any of the videos from Terra, the Journal of Space Commerce. Francisco, as we talked about a little bit earlier, Virgin Galactic is ready to resume flights maybe as early as people listen to this podcast on Thursday today. What does that mean for Spaceport America?
A lot of activity, Tom. That's what it means, a lot of activity. What the expectation is that activity is going to ramp up, that that the activity is actually coming up. So that is the expectation that we have. Actually, as we currently speak, we're filling out some of the positions that we have available, because the idea is precisely the level of activity that is not just from Virgin, right? Which the success that they have with their launch starting from tomorrow, right? We'll start seeing a ramp up of activity, a ramp up of the airspace or the use of the airspace, and more people coming into New Mexico, more people coming into Las Cruces or coming into TRC, and starting actually to have a higher frequency of the number of individuals that would be launching out of Spaceport America. So you can expect a higher level of economic activity coming up. Tom, that's just from one customer, right? Which is from Virgin's perspective, plus all of the other customers that we have and that we're taking care of. So the expectation from Spaceport America is, let's get going. The level of work is just going to continue to increase. Let's keep it going. Let's keep the momentum building. Actually, that's probably the key word that I want you to leave for your listeners as well. Kind of like on that momentum aspect, right? About moving and improving on day.
After that last Virgin Galactic flight, there was a deviation in the trajectory that was not communicated to the FAA due to an oversight. Now, the FAA investigated that and they cleared Virgin Galactic for flight, but as an FAA licensed launch facility, how have they been to work with? I'm talking about the FAA. Are they too conservative? Are they supportive in what it is that you're doing? What has been your kind of interaction with the FAA?
I think it's actually more in the aerospace side, so with that separate section of the team, but we have a very good relationship with the FAA, Tom. So I think that especially as the level of activity continues to increase, I mean, we have built this relationship not just with them, but Virgin has also built this relationship with them that has been happening throughout the years. So I think that it's a good perspective. It's actually a good vision that they have. But of course, I cannot speak on behalf of them, right? But I would see it from our perspective that it's actually good.
When you talk about new business development, everybody kind of divides the world right now into pre-COVID and post-COVID. And maybe we're forgetting about the whole 2 years in the middle where nothing was going on.
Yes.
What is it that you're seeing now as a business development person, as far as investments are concerned? Have people gotten more cautious? Have they gotten more conservative? Or are they ready to really get back into business?
You know, it's interesting that you say that right there, Tom, because from the perspective, you know, my deformation as economist, right? Sometimes there was some decreases from the private sector in terms of the investments, but the opposite started happening from the public sector, right? Especially as more activity with the Space Force started ramping up, special activity with some of the conflicts that have happened with other countries. The Department of Defense started also. So the level, I think, of activity from the public side has also increased. And that helps a lot of the private companies themselves, right? So if your customer is DoD, or if your customer is DOE, or if your customer is NASA, those levels of activity for those companies are going to continue to increase. So as we see, right, if the level of activity from the government and the public side start increasing, well, that rises the level of activity for all the companies and for the entire industry themselves, right? Even if there is some decreases that happen from the private capital, which in some cases it has seen, in some you haven't. But I think that for us, it still represents an increase in economic activity, right? Because from the public side, you're increasing some of the contracts for a lot of the customers. And if the customers are needing to ramp up their activities, well, then the frequency in which they launch and the frequency in which they do an activity over here, the number of people that you need to have inside, the number of jobs that you have to create, perhaps in TRC or maybe in cruises, those numbers also continue to increase. So I think it's kind of like a balance, right? So the level of activity, perhaps from the private side or from the private funds, where I wouldn't say that decreased, but slowed down a little bit, right? And then the level of activity from the public side and public customers that increased as well. So for us, it has been a positive, good way actually, because it has balanced out.
When you look at, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, but when you look at the big coastal spaceports, and I'm thinking mostly Cape Canaveral and Vandenberg, and you talked a little bit about what makes you competitive in that arena, but what does it take to convince a launch company to say, you know what, we've got this great thing in New Mexico, as opposed to going to one of the big two?
Right. So I think that we're perfect for a lot of companies. So what it takes is a lot of talking, right? What it takes is going out and doing the outreach and actually meeting the folks and actually sitting down and noticing exactly what is it that they need. And us talking, okay, yes, we can accommodate this. Yes, we cannot accommodate this. Because so that's what it takes, right? Going out and being out there and communicating with people and actually finding the right person on the other side that can communicate the idea to you. But you're absolutely right? So one of the perspectives that we have seen is that some of the of the coastals, right? What you can do at the coastals is very different from what you can do here, especially because of the orbital, right? Mm-hmm. At the coastals, you can have your 2-stage, and it can fall and it falls on the water, so it's not that big of a deal, right? Whereas here it's inland, so you would have some of those other perspectives happening because yes, it's a big facility, but once you are very high in space, 600 kilometers above, I mean, it's a completely different thing. It's right. It's not so large anymore, right? So those are the things that we have to keep in mind, that we have, I think, a niche in the suborbital, and that here's the other thing. We also have a level of activity that we're seeing increasing, because I think that the frequency of the flights that are happening in some of the coastal spaceports is increasing. So I think that their schedule is getting full as well. So since their schedule is getting full as well, we're also getting calls as to, okay, what are some of the things that we can do in some of the inland spaceports, which is in our case, and we're seeing some activity ramping up because of that too.
You're very right on that. I think last year SpaceX alone did 50 launches, and probably the bulk of those were from Cape Canaveral. When you add in everybody else that launches from down there, and as I said, that's just down the road from me here in Florida, it's a lot of activity, and there needs to be, particularly I would think for the suborbital market, someplace else that they can go that they just don't have to worry about the traffic. Exactly. So tell me a little bit about kind of some of the non-space related activities there at Spaceport America, because I know back when I was writing in the aviation business, there was, I know that Spaceport America was one of the places that was involved in the BVLOS, the Beyond Visual Line of Sight flight for drones. Is that still going on out there? And are those kinds of things part of your overall business plan?
Oh, yes. And we have actually seen a ramp up in some of those types of businesses. 3 of our tenants, actually, now that I think about it, 3 of our tenants are drones, right? So, are in the drone business, not that they're drones, but they're in the drone business. We have also seen some growth, mostly in the communication side, which is interesting, right? You can have some aspects in the roles in the communication side with some of the growth that we have seen. And we also have a lot of, as I was mentioning, a lot of the experimental types of things, right? So we do have the restricted airspace that allows you to do a lot of things, but in many cases, you don't need the restricted airspace, right? You just need a flat place in which you can conduct different types of things with safely, right? So one of the key aspects that we have is that we have a 24/7 EMS, security, and fire on site at Spaceport America all the time. So whenever you have to turn something on fire, whenever you have to check the stress one specific aspect of your operations or your apparatus, you can do it at Spaceport America. We can see the different aspects, and we have the capacity to do it precisely because we have all of those services immediately available, right? So we can conduct the businesses in 2 days, right? Depending on the type of activity that we have. For instance, we had a customer that came in, they were testing one specific aspect about the specific apparatus, and they did it in 2 days, right? And it was quick, it was fast. They're close enough that they could travel to Albuquerque. They're close enough that they can travel to El Paso. So it was one of those ways in which they could do it. So yes, we have a lot of testing from the non-aerospace side. We have a lot of drones. 3 of our customers, of our tenants, are actually located in drones, and we have actually seen some growth in the communication side. So we have seen all of those areas as well. There's other customers that are coming in and that are also looking for more on the manufacturing side, which is interesting, right? Because you wouldn't think of the spaceport necessarily as a manufacturing side, but you would think of as some of that additional value added. We're still in talks. It's nothing official yet, but yes, to me it was interesting that there was interest even from that perspective happening at Spaceport America, and we're highly interested, right? Because as Virgin continues to increase the use of the airspace, along with some of the other providers, even the use of our airspace is going to be with more traffic, right? Because we still have to coordinate with White Sands. So what we would need to do is start focusing and diversifying, right, our industrial base, so that we have a lot of customers that do not necessarily need to use the airspace, but still that represents our revenue, that still represents jobs, that still represents an economic impact to the state and to the cities that are surrounding us, and to the counties that are surrounding us.
Francisco, we're just about out of time, and we ask all of our guests this question. So I want you to look out over the next 10 to 15 years in space commerce and the role of Spaceport America, and tell me what you see.
What an exciting question. Thank you, Tom, for that question. I do see us figuring out a way in which we can make Spaceport America a hub for both logistical aspects in aerospace. We can see a high frequency of the travel. We're right now thinking about ways in which we can make use of the rail that is immediately in front of Spaceport America, right? It's immediately adjacent to it. It doesn't necessarily connect yet, right? But I would not see it as something far-fetched that we can start thinking of Spaceport America and having this use of the restricted airspace as having that value added, that additional production, right, into how can we deliver things across the world in 2 hours, right? Having that ability to do it in a fast way, in a safe way, and how can we make it happen worldwide in a faster way? I see ourselves as having a role to play in that specific area. I really do. So I think that we currently have this, not just because of the airspace, but we currently have the infrastructure, or with a few tweaks that we could do to the infrastructure, that we could already start doing things of that nature. So I think that to us, and especially with the ramping up of services and the growth in the technology that we have seen, actually, you have seen it with Amazon, right? You can order things and just deliver it in 2 days, and having that efficiency. Well, how can we increase that efficiency to not just making it in inland United States, having it in 2 days, but having it in the world, right? So that's one of the things in which I think there's a lot of potential for us. Additionally to that, of course, having all of the aspects of the aerospace related, also with that re-entry license that we're currently working on, and some of the other customers that we could have going on at Spaceport America. And ultimately, looking at the orbital, hopefully in the future, right? If there's a vehicle that would be safe enough to be using the spaceport, this inland spaceport, potentially for orbital as well. So those are probably the three major areas in which I would see our spaceport playing a crucial role in getting a greater niche of the markets that we have from that perspective.
Dr. Francisco Pallares, thank you very much for joining me on the Xterra podcast. It's been an interesting conversation.
Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you for the invitation, and let us know how can we help, and we'll be happy to assist.
One of these days we'll come out and visit. I like New Mexico.
I like New Mexico too.
Good. There you go. Dr. Francisco Pallares has been selected as the new Director of Business Development at Spaceport America. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Xterra podcast. You can subscribe to the audio version of the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Audible, and many other popular podcasting platforms. Be sure to click on subscribe so you don't miss any episode of the podcast or any of our other videos. You can also get daily space commerce news at xterrajsc.com. And one thing more, be sure to connect with us on LinkedIn and follow us on Twitter at xterrajsc. Until next time, I'm Tom Patton. Thanks for joining us.
I wanna go faster, faster. Hands in the air, we're gonna crash. Searching for the answers. My Galileo through his looking glass. Thirst for reason. Our dreamer's eyes we gaze into a sense of purpose. Know my view. Like finding water on the moon.